20 years ago, this stunned the world. A defining moment with chilling links to Southeast Asia.
People forget and are surprised by the fact that the Philippines actually served as a staging ground and test runs for 9/11.
This was a very ambitious plot to bomb 11 commercial US airliners over the Pacific in a single day.
The plane really banked to the right.
From the past,
9/11 was certainly psychologically empowering for the Abu Sayyaf group.
to the present,
Even with the onset of a new Bangsamoro region, extremism is still a problem.
and the future.
History could repeat itself. With Afghanistan having fallen to the Taliban, it could open up a new chapter of terror, one that affects the Philippines.
What's happening in Mindanao should be a concern not only with the Philippines, but the whole of Southeast Asia.
How has terror in the Philippines changed? September 11th, 2001.
This is history. It's a tragedy.
Al-Qaeda hijackers crashed 4 planes into the United States. Nearly 3,000 people died. But 6 years prior, the seeds of the attack were already being planted in the Philippines.
When people think about the 9/11 attacks today, they tend to conjure up this image of it being planned in some dark cave in Afghanistan. However, people forget and are surprised by the fact that the Philippines actually served as a staging ground for many of the precursor and test runs for 9/11.
The warning bell was sounded in 1995. It was known as the Bojinka Plot. Bojinka was thought to mean Big Bang.
It was planned in Manila, in the Philippines. They specifically selected 11 jetliners from Asia, the American Airlines, in order to create greater shocks to the American people.
The mission? Blow up those passenger jets as they flew from Asia to the United States.
One of the terrorists involved, he was supposed to fly on a United Airlines flight from Singapore to Hong Kong. And during this leg, he would sort of place explosive on board the aircraft. He would get off in Hong Kong, but then the flight would then carry on to Los Angeles. The bomb would be primed to blow up over the Pacific en route to Los Angeles.
The brains behind it was top Al-Qaeda leader Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, mastermind of the 9/11 attacks. During the planning of the plot, he lived in Manila, together with his nephew Ramzi Youssef, an experienced bomb maker. In a test run just 1 month before Bojinka was to be carried out, Youssef would prove the plan was indeed possible. He sneaked a bomb under a seat of a Philippine Airlines flight.
When we heard the loud explosion, the plane really banked to the right.
Fernando Bayot was on that plane from Cebu to Tokyo when the bomb exploded mid-air.
The smoke of the gunpowder is really obvious that everybody can smell it. One Japanese passenger was killed. I saw a hole. He was sunk on that hole, and I pulled him out, but definitely he's dead already. It happened 26 years ago, December 11, 1994. I can still recall it up to now. Even at my age right now, I'm 69, and yet I cannot forget what really happened on that day.
Despite that success, the Bojinka Plot did not go through. In January 1995, just weeks before the scheduled attacks, Ramzi Youssef and his associate were mixing chemicals in his Manila apartment when they accidentally started a fire. They fled, leaving behind vast amounts of evidence, including a laptop with details of the attacks.
If the Bojinka Plot had succeeded, 4,000 civilian passengers would have died. And these would not just have been Americans, would have been people from the region. We're talking about the Filipinos, Koreans, Malaysians, Singaporeans. The Bojinka Plot also involved a side plot where an aircraft would fly into the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. So in many ways, if you think about it, right, the Bojinka Plot was very much a proof of concept for Al-Qaeda for what transpired several years later in September 11. So this was a very significant plot in the history of international terrorism.
But why did Al-Qaeda pick the Philippines?
The choice of the Philippines to use as a staging ground might seem like an odd choice, but it was actually a very natural fit. First, we have to remember that there was a long history between Al-Qaeda and members of the Abu Sayyaf group, which means that they knew that they could call on the Abu Sayyaf group for help, and with good reason. The Abu Sayyaf group is one of the most notorious groups to come out of the Philippines. There was a personal connection between Osama Bin Laden and the founder of the Abu Sayyaf group. The two men had reportedly fought alongside each other against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Osama Bin Laden, a wealthy Saudi national, had joined the Afghan resistance. He provided funds, but also took part in the battle himself.
When Osama Bin Laden called for a global jihad, more than 1,000 Muslim Filipinos went to Afghanistan to drive away the Soviets at that time.
So Afghanistan was like a crucible. Within the crucible of Afghanistan, relationships were forged. So this was how the Al-Qaeda Abu Sayyaf nexus was formed.
The Abu Sayyaf group grew out of the fight for an independent Islamic state in the southern Philippines. The Philippines is a majority Christian country. But Islam is the second largest religion, and a large population of indigenous Muslims live in the islands of the south.
For several decades, there had been a conflict between the southern Philippine Muslims, or the Moros, against the central Catholic government in Manila. The Abu Sayyaf conducted operations against the Philippine military. At the same time, they conducted terrorist strikes against civilians as well.
The mission of Abu Sayyaf group was plainly waging a jihad to establish Islamic State in the Philippines.
They engaged in behavior like kidnappings, murder, especially gruesome beheadings, extortion, and robbery. But as Al-Qaeda started to rise in prominence on the global stage, the Abu Sayyaf group took ideological inspiration, funding, and training from them.
It was a very fertile ground for Al-Qaeda to come and fish troubled waters, right?
And then came 9/11.
9/11 was certainly psychologically empowering for the Abu Sayyaf group because they had this personal connection to Al-Qaeda, which had just managed to take down one of the biggest targets in the West, in the United States itself.
The September 11 attack emboldened Abu Sayyaf, and this is very clear, in early 2004, they mounted the worst maritime terrorist attack, certainly in the Philippines, when they bombed the passenger ferry, Super Ferry 14, in Manila Bay. It cost 116 lives. So it was a very major attack.
On the heels of the Super Ferry 14 bombing, Abu Sayyaf executed the Valentine's Day bombings, which happened the following year in 2005. 3 bombs went off almost simultaneously in Mindanao and Manila. One of the intended targets of the attack was then President Arroyo and her family, who were supposed to be dining at a nearby hotel. Arroyo and her family weren't hurt that day, but not everyone was so lucky. When the bombs went off, 8 people were killed and 147 were wounded. These attacks show that Abu Sayyaf had moved to a fully fledged terror organization that dealt in mass bombings and inspired mass terror.
But by 2006, Philippine forces began making progress in restraining Abu Sayyaf. The US had pumped in hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to eliminate the group it had designated as a terror organization.
The United States played a vital role in the crackdown because after 9/11, the United States implemented the Joint Special Operation Task Force Philippines. The United States also conducted a lot of intelligence sharing with the Philippines and counterterrorism training and also joint operations.
Following the intensified security force pressure on the Abu Sayyaf group, they became factionalized. They were not really able to mount very significant attacks.
Bravo 1, the commandos are moving punks to my building.
At the same time, the US was aggressively pursuing Al-Qaeda.
Because of the lack of funding coming from Al-Qaeda, because the United States was already pursuing Osama Bin Laden, Abu Sayyaf group started to mount, kidnap for ransom, and other criminal activities, specifically targeting foreign nationals in order to get money.
Essentially, they were a bunch of bandits or criminals. They were not so ideological at that time. The Abu Sayyaf was weakened. They were not destroyed.
Down, but certainly not out. In fact, the Abu Sayyaf would mount a violent return.
We are used to seeing these kinds of images coming out of places like Iraq or Syria, but to see it happening in the Philippines,
After 2006, a splintered Abu Sayyaf group remained weakened. But less than a decade later, it would return to global attention.
By mid-2014, a very significant geopolitical development had occurred, and this was the rise of ISIS in the Middle East. And this had a very galvanizing impact around the world. In the southern Philippines, the Abu Sayyaf factions were similarly galvanized.
One of the group's leaders, Isnilon Hapilon, even released a video pledging allegiance to ISIS.
2 years later, ISIS anointed Hapilon as the emir of ISIS in the Philippines and ISIS East Asia. This marked Hapilon's rise to terrorist superstardom.
The emergence of Isnilon Hapilon, this was the beginning of the road to Marawi, which was one of the most destructive battles in southern Philippine history, and certainly in recent times.
May 2017, Marawi, the deadliest battle in the Philippines since World War II. An entire city in the southern Philippines under siege.
The plan for Marawi was for Isnilon Hapilon to serve as an ISIS general of sorts, marshal troops and fighters from across the Philippines to Marawi, lay siege to the city, occupy it, and to establish a caliphate that spanned East Asia.
The Philippines, specifically Marawi City, will be the headquarters of this Islamic State province in East Asia.
Hapilon teamed up with local militants under the Maute group and other extremists who had been fighting for an independent Islamic State in southern Philippines. But the battle attracted foreign radicals as well.
The international consequences of Marawi were such that it attracted fighters from around the world. There were Indonesians, there were Malaysians involved, there were even Middle Easterners involved, and this definitely was not just a localized Philippine concern. You know, your Indonesians or Malaysians could have gone back to their own countries and caused mayhem as well. It would have been like an outpost to fan out and cause security concerns for the rest of the neighboring countries.
We saw horrific scenes emerge in the Philippines, of all places, and in Asia. We are used to seeing these images coming out of places like Iraq, or Syria, or Libya, or Yemen, but to see it happening in the Philippines, we saw civilians being abducted and used as human shields. The militants ransacked a cathedral, they occupied the city hall and hospitals, and they reduced people's homes to rubble in the process. Over 400,000 people were displaced from their homes, and thousands of them remain with nowhere to go today.
It would take Philippine forces 5 months to finally regain control of the city. More than 200 soldiers and civilians lost their lives. Over 900 militants were killed, including Isnilon Hapilon.
The Philippine government had triumphed, but their victory came at a terrible cost.
Today, 4 years later, the scars of the battle are still visible. Some of the worst affected areas still resemble a ghost town. These graves remain a haunting memory. Loved ones killed, but not really laid to rest.
Dito makikita natin na wala po nakalagay na pangalan. Ang nakalagay lang po dito ay yung serial po ng pagkakakilanlan ng kada verse. Marami pa pong mga pamilya natin na naghihintay na mabigyan ng hustisya at pagkakakilanlan ang mga bangkay na naiburol dito. Ako po ay namatayan din ng kamag-anak at hindi ko rin po hanggang sa ngayon ma-confirm kung nandito sila. At ako po ay nagpunta at magsumite ng DNA at hanggang sa ngayon po ay wala pa rin po kami nakikitang match o hustisya para sa aking namatayan ng kamag-anak.
In terms of making sure to get DNA samples and to make sure that the graves are marked so that this can be retrieved by families later on, that has not been prioritized. What was prioritized was to just bury the dead. And so after the siege, because of the weather and the markings are not distinguishable anymore, the graves are still an open wound for people who were displaced in Marawi.
Another festering wound is the endless wait for a return to normal life. The government had promised to rebuild Marawi by the end of 2021, but that remains a promise.
Then there were people who had proper full houses in the main affected area which were destroyed or damaged. Some of them are resentful that they were not allowed to go back and rebuild. Of course, the government's view, which is also valid, is that the area needed to be rid of unexploded ordnance of dangerous sites before anyone could go back.
Ito po yung aming bahay na masasabi ko po na sirang-sira na. Yung mga bubong po ay nakikita pa rin po ang mga bala na pinagdaanan at mga bomba kung saan ang aming maliit na bahay ay talagang nawasak. Sa tagal na po ito ay hindi pa rin po naayos hanggang ngayon. Mahigit 4 na taon na po kami naghihintay na kami makabalik.
Wala kaming babalikan doon sa lugar namin. Gawa nung yung bahay namin, nahulugan ng bomba. Wasak na. So sana po magkaroon po kami ng permanent shelter kasi hindi na talaga kami makakabalik doon sa dati naming bahay. Lalo na ang pandemya, walang hanap buhay po. Mahirap po ang buhay namin.
The pandemic last year was a setback of some sorts. The workers, most of them went home, and after several months, they slowly returned. Unfortunately, some did not return anymore. But now, even with the on and off quarantine restrictions, construction continues. The road infrastructure is, I think, around 70% complete. the water system is being constructed, and the lights, the poles are, as we speak, being erected. So these are the priority.
Meanwhile, most of the nearly 100,000 residents are still waiting for permanent housing like this. As the rebuilding drags on, residents must make do with temporary shelters.
People are frustrated, people are resentful, people are disappointed, and people are angry. You're talking about cramped spaces without water, without running water. With the pandemic, you would need access to water. Even without the pandemic, I can feel people suffering during monsoon season with heavy rains. They would have, their houses would have leaks. There's a lot of children just playing around outside. You wonder, what's the future for these children? We have youth partners in the area, and they would say, we've stopped dreaming because our lives are suspended.
That sense of hopelessness is dangerous.
Sigurado talaga ako 100% na may nakatira pa ditong ISIS dito sa Marawi.
This young man, we will call him Wahid, says pro-ISIS militants tried to recruit him before the siege. Wahid managed to walk away, but now he's disillusioned with life in Marawi.
Sana sumama na lang ako sa mga ISIS na yun para gumanda rin yung buhay ko. Sabi nila sa akin, gaganda daw yung buhay ko. Tsaka sila na daw yung bahala sa pamilya ko. Susuportahan nila. Sa pagkakaalam ko, mayroon pa rin nagre-recruit na mga ISIS dito sa Marawi. Pero ayaw lang nila magpakita kasi natatakot talaga sila. Kailangan talaga mabigyan ng trabaho yung mga tao para hindi sila ma-recruit ng ISIS. Tsaka sa palagay ko, pag nabigyan sila ng trabaho, hindi na talaga sila marirecruit ng ISIS. Tsaka hindi talaga sila nasama sa ISIS.
The slow rehabilitation process of Marawi City is one of the reasons why the ISIS elements in the Philippines continue to recruit fighters, especially those belonging to the low-income families.
And the big push now is really for Congress to pass the Marawi compensation bill. People are saying they need money. What has happened was that there was a menu of things that people would get in terms of livelihood packages. Fiberglass fishing boats, this included sewing machines, tricycles, and so on. But because it's something that is not suitable in terms of their skill set, most of them have resorted to selling this to get money, because they say, just give us money and we will do what we need to do. We must remember that the Maranaos are entrepreneurs. They know how the industry there of local economies.
Another Marawi down the road cannot be completely ruled out if the pace of reconstruction does not speed up, if the problems of economic losses, social disruptions, housing, COVID-19 are not adequately addressed. This would essentially give rise to the next generation of angry young people who would be ripe for radicalization by violent Islamist groups. I can't completely rule out another Marawi from happening down the road.
How can another Marawi be prevented then? Does it all hinge on a fragile peace deal?
I am afraid that if the barm collapses, that the agenda of the caliphate will be back.
A 5-hour drive away from Marawi is Cotabato City. Like Marawi, it is home to a large population of the indigenous Muslims of the Philippines, otherwise known as the Moro people. In majority Catholic Philippines, the Moros have a long history of struggling for self-determination. And here, local musicians are using song to tell their story.
Ang pinapahiwatig ng kanta namin na ito is, imbis na humawak ng barel, is mas mabuti na lang na mag-aral para maiwasan na natin yung mga gulo at gusto namin ng kapayapaan.
Sa napapansin ko, sa aming mga lahing Bangsamoro, ang hirap umasenso. So, kaya nga yung kanta ko, gusto kong mamulat yung mga kabataan. Napakahalaga yung kapayapaan para din sa mga next generation ng Bangsamoro.
The conflict in the southern Philippines goes back centuries.
To this day, we can see the traces of the almost 400 years of Spanish rule over the Philippines.
Moro people struggled for their right to self-determination, which started back in the 1500s during the Spanish colonization era.
And then, of course, the Americans came in 1898. The Americans pursued the same occupation campaign against these communities.
After 48 years of American sovereignty, the people of the Philippines assumed the status of an independent nation.
With the independence, the Filipino government tried to impose again its control and incorporate these areas into the body politic. So this is a resistance to their inclusion made by Spain, by the Americans, or by the Filipino government since time immemorial. And it has come up in many different forms.
It led to the loss of their ancestral domains and natural resources. And this resentment would eventually transform into a more systematic opposition against the Philippine government in the 1960s.
That opposition would lead to hostilities and eventually create one of Southeast Asia's bloodiest conflicts. Insurgent groups would form and splinter, with some prepared to negotiate and others rejecting any peace process. One of those committed to violence was the notorious Abu Sayyaf group.
The Abu Sayyaf group was a splinter group of far bigger Moro separatist organizations. Abu Sayyaf group was committed to using armed jihad to create an Islamic State in the Philippines.
Another separatist group is the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or MILF. The group is on a different path now, but in the past was linked to violence and terror attacks too.
There have been instances when members of the MILF, together with members of the Abu Sayyaf group and the Jemaah Islamiyah group, a terrorist group from Indonesia, have staged attacks. So for example, in 2003, there was the Davao airport bombing, which led to the death of about 20 people and the injury of about 150 people. However, it should be noted, in 2003, when the government demanded that they officially disavow their links to the terrorist groups, the MILF consented to the demand.
Over the decades, the MILF has negotiated with each government of the day.
Do not be very optimistic.
There were many failed attempts at an agreement.
They would sign ceasefires, but those ceasefires would eventually break down. The government would pursue at least 2 all-out wars against the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, leading to massive displacement and deaths of civilian populations and soldiers. In fact, some people would say that they have gotten so used to the conflicts because of these repeated failures.
But in 2014,
the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro is the crowning glory of our struggle.
a breakthrough under the Aquino government.
The signed agreement on the Bangsamoro. President Benigno S. Aquino, Chairman Alhaj Murad Ibrahim.
The comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro was a landmark peace deal. It embodies the Moro's dream of self-determination.
So this is really about ownership and about esteem and about pride. At the core of Bangsamoro is really the religion of Islam basically pervades their identity as Bangsamoro.
When the Bangsamoro Organic Law was ratified, you could sense that people's hopes were very high. It was like a fiesta atmosphere. It was like a big feast where people got together, the young people went out into the streets, they cooked food, you had them dancing. So it's something that I haven't seen in the Bangsamoro in a long while.
Finally, in 2019, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao was created. Simply called the BAM, it encompasses 5 Muslim-majority provinces in the south. Marawi is part of the BAM, as is Cotabato City, which serves as the center of government.
Both the government and the MILF has always referred to the peace deal as the antidote to terrorism. The MILF said that by addressing the historic grievances of the Moro, the violent extremism would eventually become irrelevant.
But while establishing the BAM may be a huge step forward, it cannot be the last.
Even with the onset of a new Bangsamoro region, extremism is still a problem. You still have sightings of foreign terrorist groups arriving in the islands, including in the mainland areas of Mindanao.
Yes, terror groups could exploit this because terror groups require a community that basically supports them or at least does not oppose them.
Cover!
Getting rid of extremism is a challenge MILF leaders must contend with. They are now at the helm of an interim government.
It is a headache. I will not deny that it's a headache. Judging from what we experienced in Marawi in 2017, they still pose as a threat to our security of our communities, of our streets.
And here in the Bangsamoro Mountains, extremist groups can find cover. The Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, or BIFF, is one group that has refused to accept the peace deal and continues with attacks. For them, autonomy is not enough.
Di kami lang sa mga kasulutan sin mga yan, ang kabayaan namo, matabot na mo tuudin kasabunnalan. At niya, ikabalik marikato, inhulatan niyo, iban makawatan yung kamahaldikaan, simbang sa muro.
It is a continuing challenge. Hopefully, the problem of the BIF will be solved. That's a hope, that's a prayer. But again, should not be held hostage by what these people believed in. To put on hold all the services of the government. Terrorism is a constant threat. ISIS still is an imminent threat.
Be it from ISIS or militants that reject the peace deal, the BAM remains vulnerable to terror. Adding to the tensions are problems like poverty. The Bangsamoro is one of the poorest regions in the Philippines. COVID-19 has only made matters worse. The slow rebuilding of Marawi is another concern.
Terror groups could capitalize on that and spread the narrative that the transitional government has failed and the peace process has also failed. Terror groups have always capitalized on the volatility and instability of Bangsamoro.
I am deeply worried by the effect it can have because if the BARM collapses, I think it will reopen the agenda of a caliphate in Southeast Asia. We all know that ISIS had targeted the possibility of creating an organization that would unite different jihadist groups in Southeast Asia. You will have problems in Indonesia, you will have problems in Singapore, you will have problems in Malaysia. I am afraid that if the BARM collapses, that the agenda of the caliphate will be back.
The interim government has its work cut out, especially now as a threat from miles away comes back to haunt.
History could repeat itself.
Afghanistan was like a crucible. Relationships were forged.
More than 1,000 Muslim Filipinos went to Afghanistan to drive away the Soviets at that time.
This gave rise to the origins of the Abu Sayyaf.
Events in Afghanistan have long affected the terror landscape in the Philippines. Now, with the Taliban in control again, there are fears over what lies ahead.
The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated.
The fall of Kabul, is concerning because it might be a portent of worse things to come. It might inspire violent extremist groups and terror groups in the Bangsamoro to strengthen their ranks.
History could repeat itself. Filipinos could take up arms and travel to Afghanistan to fight alongside these terror cells and the Taliban, like they did in the 1980s against the Soviets. Historically, the Taliban, as we know, shielded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda remnants have been in the region for years, waiting for an opening to reconstitute and rebuild.
Not just Al-Qaeda, but ISIS too could further exploit tensions in the Bangsamoro.
One of the major reasons why the Marawi siege happened because of pro-ISIS elements, they propagated this narrative that the Moro Islamic Liberation Front already sold out the cause of Islam in the Philippines.
And there is yet another threat from ISIS.
ISIS is glorifying suicide terrorism and they are propagating that in the BARM area.
So we've had Indonesians, we've had an Egyptian, we've had a German national of Moroccan origins involved in suicide bombings in Mindanao.
The second explosive device went off at around 1 in the afternoon.
All of the attacks took place in the BARM. And of the 8 suicide bombers in recent years, all but one have been foreigners.
That is indicative of the ability of different foreign groups to enter easily and create havoc in the region. And that means the threat remains for the Bangsamoro.
With threats coming from so many different sources, keeping the Bangsamoro peace process on track is paramount.
A lot needs to be done. In particular, more effective counter-narratives in the sense of showing the extremist ideology is wrong. And also, importantly, success stories from BARM's effectiveness in delivering good governance are very important because it will show to the Moro population that life can be good, life can be better.
1, 2, 3, go!
Efforts to make the BARM a success story are underway. On the outskirts of Cotabato City, a group of former MILF combatants who fought in the insurgency are now training to be peacekeepers.
Lack of employment, lack of opportunities. So those are the things that make people took up arms and wage a war. Of course, there's a problem. That's why we reach out to these rebels.
Our time in the battlefield is over.
As part of the peace deal, There are programs to help thousands of former fighters to put down their weapons. For every firearm handed over, they receive money to help them rebuild their lives.
Yung pag-return namin ng baril, yun kapalit, binigyan kami ng pangkabuhayan cash na 100,000 para makaano kami ng mga negosyo, para makapitala namin. Yun pong maganda talaga yung decommissioning. Kumbaga kung ano ka dati nang nag-aawak-awak, normal na yung life mo na hindi ka na makadala-dala ng baril para makapatayo ka na ng mga ganito, mga negosyo.
Former fighters like Ismail are now earning a living by picking up new skills. This outreach project helps train them in fish farming.
Now that we had the Bangsamoro peace process, we wanted to contribute to them na hindi na sila bumalik doon sa direction na yun. And that's why we're supporting them as one of our beneficiaries. So with that, they're able to understand how they can develop their own social enterprise or start up their own business, integrate Islamic finance, and become productive citizens of the country.
Yun ano ko sa fish pond, kung hindi na-develop yung mga ganito, yung mga dike niya, malaking tulong po sa karamihan namin mga membro ng MILF na sanay marunan ng pansin ng yung anak buhay nila. Hindi tulad ng dati na takbo-takbo kay ganyan, takot baka ulim.
A lot of these fighters do not have legal identity in the Philippines. They have no certificate of birth. They have now papers to show that they are citizens of this country. This is really about who gives them a better future rather than just go down the rabbit hole of extremism.
20 years since 9/11. There might be setbacks, but the battle against terror in the Philippines must continue.
And let's not forget that 9/11 is a story that began in Afghanistan and played out in part in the Philippines. And with Afghanistan having fallen to the Taliban, it could open up a new chapter of terror.
There really needs to be concerted effort to deal with the pace of Marawi reconstruction. Otherwise, this will be further grist for the violent Islamist propaganda mill and will be a powerful tool for radicalization of new recruits into the violent Islamist extremism and the future generations.
The past 20 years, the Philippine government has achieved a lot of things in countering terrorism. They have now a better understanding of the threat and better countermeasures. Challenge is the Philippine government needs to outsmart these terrorist groups.
I think the single biggest threat for terror in southern Philippines is the failure of the bomb, because that will bring forth a lot of extremism. What's happening in Mindanao should be a concern not only of the Philippines but the whole of Southeast Asia, because of the links between these groups, whether they be Indonesia, Malaysia, or even, I would say, even Singapore. And these networks are alive.